Renaissance Studies, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to another lecture in our ad hoc lecture series. Professor Frederick Kiefer is University Distinguished Professor of English at the University of Arizona. He was educated at Loyola in Maryland and then at Harvard, somewhere near Maryland, I understand. And he's been at the University of Arizona pretty much his entire career. He's well designated as distinguished professor because he's a very important voice in medieval and Renaissance studies, specifically in Elizabethan and Jacobean drama. He's published books with the Huntington Library, for example, Cambridge University Press, for example, and we are very pleased to have published his most recent book, which is 3 times bigger than his other books. This is something you all should know about if you're interested in Elizabethan Jacobean drama, English drama from Everyman to 1660, performance in print. And everything you want to know about any of those plays and everything in between is contained in this volume. He's, mostly I wanted to tell you what a tremendously wise and learned man he is. Wisdom and learning are not always yoked in academia or any profession for that matter. It's easy to be learned. It's much more difficult to be wise. And the center has benefited from his wisdom ever since I became director, and I think before as well. He's always been affiliated with ACMRS. He's on our advisory committee. He edited one of the volumes that came out of one of our conferences, Masculinities and Femininities in the Middle Ages and Renaissance. Both these books are on the table behind you, by the way, if you want to take a look at them. And he's co-editing with Ian Moulton at the Polytechnic campus and downtown campus. This series for Brepols publishers in Belgium, late medieval and early modern studies. He's always willing to volunteer to share his knowledge and expertise, and that's why he drove an hour and a half up here just to meet with you today. So it's my pleasure to introduce you to a true gentleman and a scholar. You won't meet many of his like.
Well, thank you, Bob, for a very gracious introduction. I am just delighted to be here at Arizona State University, our sister university. As he lies dying, Hamlet makes a request of his only friend. "Tell my story," he says. And almost immediately, we listen to the preview that Horatio offers the English ambassador. "Let me speak to the yet unknowing world how these things came about. So shall you hear of carnal, bloody, and unnatural acts, of accidental judgments, casual slaughters, of deaths put on by cunning and for no cause, and in this upshot purposes mistook. Fall on the adventurers' heads. All this I could truly deliver." When an eager Fortinbras replies, "Let us haste to hear it," we may expect a counterpart of the friar's speech at the end of Romeo and Juliet, but no such summary is forthcoming. We have just heard the only account we shall hear from Horatio, and what occupies some 70 lines in Romeo is here confined to 5. Similarly, Horatio's brief speech contains nothing like the detail of Hieronymo's 79-line explanation of events in Thomas Kyd's Spanish tragedy, the most influential play of his time. Kyd, of course, almost certainly furnished the chief source of Hamlet, and probably inspired Shakespeare to adopt the name Horatio. Horatio's words to the ambassador have pleased almost no one. Ann Thompson and Neil Taylor, in their recent edition of Hamlet, captured the prevailing dissatisfaction. Quote, "Horatio's list covers, without necessarily itemizing, most of the play's crimes and deaths. Some of them could be placed in more than one category. Several critics have found the vagueness and generality of this account unsatisfactory. Horatio fails to give the onstage audience any of the specific details that are known to the theater audience or reader. David Thatcher complains that Horatio's retrospective analysis is incomplete and ambiguous. Anne Barton says Horatio astonishes us by leaving out everything that seems important and reducing all that is distinctive about the play to a plot stereotype. Linda Charnes terms Horatio's account the first Cliff's Notes version of Hamlet. Christopher Worley calls him a kiss-ass. Terence Hawkes finds that Horatio's solemnity mocks at the subtleties, the innuendos, the contradictions, the imperfectly realized motives and sources for action that have been exhibited to us. Of course, it would be difficult to address in 6 lines the subtleties, innuendos, contradictions, and motives that Hawkes would like to hear. There's nothing subtle about Horatio's speech. Indeed, for many Shakespeareans, his words verge on incoherence. His list seems to tumble out pell-mell, as though he has not assimilated what he's witnessed or been able to supply a context that would make sense of what happened. His statement has a raw, spontaneous quality, alienating critics, even though his account has the virtue of immediacy. Not surprisingly, Horatio's speech is sometimes cut in performance. Despite the exegesis devoted to nearly every line of this play, Horatio's summary is generally treated as an afterthought, spoken by a subsidiary character, scarcely worthy of notice. But one critic has observed, the tragedy of Hamlet not only differs from Shakespeare's other mature tragedies in having a keen observer as hero, it's also filled with exceptionally watchful secondary characters. None of these is more important than Horatio, who holds a uniquely privileged viewpoint. He's the only character whom Hamlet admires, the only person for whom the prince has unqualified affection. He's the only figure who enjoys Hamlet's confidence, the only one who hears Hamlet relate the strange events of his abortive voyage to England, and his explanation for those events. The only person who listens to Hamlet's reflections on death in the graveyard. Horatio, moreover, is an intellectual, a fellow student with Hamlet at Edinburgh, a university renowned for philosophic and theological study. And Horatio's remarks to the ambassador are situated at the end of the play, where we might expect to hear an assessment of what we have witnessed. Horatio's overview thus warrants more than glancing attention. In fact, by the end of the play, we may, with Northrop Frye, get a strong feeling that the play we're watching is, in a sense, Horatio's story. At least one recent director appreciates Horatio's contribution. The importance of the role and of the character's relationship with Hamlet was stressed in Peter Brook's 2000 production, which allowed him both to begin and to end the play. How might Horatio's speech to the ambassador best be described? Well, essentially, he presents a catalog of events in no particular order, an account with no obvious shape. Too anarchic to qualify as a pattern, Horatio's account may more accurately be called a concatenation of appalling incidents, which he characterizes not only as bloody and unnatural, but also accidental and casual, and editors routinely observe that the word casual denotes chance. Horatio's summary constitutes what has been called a tissue of accidents. Despite the element of contingency, Shakespeareans seem impelled to find in Horatio's words an affirmation of justice, however it may have arisen. Philip Edwards glosses accidental judgments as punishments brought about fortuitously. Gwyn Evans glosses judgments as retributions. But the glosses, punishments, and retributions seem a stretch, an extension of Horatio's term judgment, which can mean, according to the OED, that which has been formally decided and pronounced to be the case, any formal or authoritative decision. An impulse to discern the hand of God behind the sequence of dramatic incidents also informs critical responses to Horatio. Harold Jenkins, in his edition of Hamlet, glosses accidental judgments as divine judgments manifested in seeming accidents. The trouble with such explanations is that the terms accidental and judgments point in different directions. The two words are in fact at odds with one another. Admittedly, the term judgment has a wide range of potential meanings, one of which is a divine pronouncement. But this is an uncommon use of the term, the fourth entry in the second category of meanings given by the OED, which cites only biblical verses with this definition in the 16th century. And even if we were to apply such a meaning to judgment, the problem of squaring accident with retribution remains. Horatio himself does not attribute those accidental judgments to the divine. His speech to the ambassador says nothing about the intervention of God's providence. The gist of Horatio's remarks, moreover, seem at odds with editorial efforts to construe those remarks as an affirmation of justice. Indeed, his last words to the ambassador convey a sense of urgency precisely because he believes that events continue to whirl out of control. He says, "Let this same be present before, even while men's minds are wild, lest more mischance on plots and errors happen. Within the psyche and the world at large, purposelessness rules. Men's minds, Horatio reports, are wild, and the operation of mischance, far from bringing a reassuring respite or a satisfying conclusion, continues to threaten mayhem. Nor does he take comfort in the demise of malefactors. Even if they suffer a comeuppance, their deaths have come about by cunning and for no cause. This sounds less like the administration of justice than a lucky but unforeseen event. Purposes mistook have fallen on the inventor's heads. Perhaps reluctant to acknowledge the darker implications of this statement, Shakespeareans feel the need for reassurance at the play's conclusion. Mostly then, they neglect Horatio's words or find reasons to disparage them. To account for Horatio's speech to the ambassador, I'd like to offer context not previously adduced. Moving outside Hamlet and backward in time, I'd like to look briefly at a popular tragedy by Thomas Preston and a masterpiece by Marlowe. Even though these earlier plays may seem to have little in common with Shakespeare's revenge tragedy, they offer a useful way of looking at Horatio's speech by the way they deal with causation. Preston's Cambyses, acted around 1561, published around 1570, has been called the most commercially successful of all early Elizabethan plays. And it possibly continued to be performed for some time following publication. Indeed, Cambyses' vein was familiar enough to the playhouse audience to be alluded to in Shakespeare's Henry IV Part 1 in the late 1590s. Dominating Cambyses is a tyrant who behaves with spectacular cruelty toward even his closest advisors and kin. Although he merits his fall, which follows a writing accident, Cambyses calls attention to the contingency involved in his death. He says, "Alas, what shall I do? My life is finished. Wounded I am by sudden chance. My blood is diminished." And before he expires, he adds, "A marvelous chance unfortunate, that in this wise should be." The issue is muddied, however, when in the same speech the dying king goes on to call his death a just reward for my misdeeds. My death would plainly clear. Critics seize on this line to interpret his death as, quote, a sensational example of divine punishment. But the king's reference to just reward sounds like an afterthought, tacked on to the acknowledgement of chance unfortunate. The play never resolves the incongruity between, on the one hand, the impulse to see a principle of retribution in Cambyses' death, and on the other, a recognition of mere contingency. The conflicting explanations stand side by side at the denouement. Preston might have finessed the disjunction by invoking fortune, and the audience might conceivably expect some reference to fortune, since chance plays so important a role in Cambyses' death. And earlier in the play, a character has already alluded to fortune, and yet we find no explicit reference. The explanation is implicit in those last words of the just reward spoken by the king. Evidently, the playwright's priority at the very end is to stress the purposefulness of Cambyses' demise, even if it appears to have been brought about by chance. Preston refrains from personifying fortune as he affirms, a little awkwardly, the justice of divine providence. After all, he recognizes that fortune and providential justice are essentially antithetical. Protestant thinkers deny that God acts through intermediaries. In the view of moralists, a Dantesque fortune, executrix of providence, has no warrant in Scripture and smacks of paganism. Writing of an ancient school of philosophy that assigned fortune such a role, John Calvin says, "I speak not of the Epicureans, which dream of an idle and slothful God, and other as mad as they, which in the old time imagined that God did so rule above the middle region of the air, he left things beneath in fortune." Calvin, fortune and divine justice are completely incompatible. He says, "Nothing less agreeth with the nature of God than to throw away the government of the world and leave it to fortune." If fortune could have easily been assigned a retributive function, she might have become more conspicuous in Cambyses and other plays of its time. The interludes, after all, are replete with figures who deserve to pay for their transgressions. As Preston's play suggests, however, there's a logical difficulty in employing fortune as a righter of wrongs. Fortune's capacity for overthrowing the wicked does not depend on any antipathy toward vice. Fortune spurns anyone who enjoys too much, aspires too high, or simply attains security for too long. And she is likely to afflict the virtuous as the villainous. Thus, in Cambyses, the one figure who complains against fortune is not a culprit, but the innocent child of a man executed by the tyrannical. 25 years or so after Cambyses, Christopher Marlowe wrote his own account of a political figure unsuited for rule. King Edward II suffers from a volatile temperament and flawed judgment. He lacks the most rudimentary instincts to govern successfully. From the outset, the trajectory of his career leads to destruction and death. If ever we may posit a connection between error and ensuing catastrophe, Edward defines it. His foolishness and weakness precipitate his downfall. The king's antagonist, meanwhile, enacts his own disaster. Although initially Mortimer seems to have the good of the kingdom at heart, he allows his ambition to topple the king and to claim the crown for himself. Ultimately, he succumbs to his own overreaching. Both downfalls, the king and the usurper, are warranted. And yet, Marlowe's play never aspires to become a mere exemplar of justice. Admittedly, characters sometimes evoke the prospect of divine oversight. Mortimer at one point says, "Lord, since we are by sufferance of heaven arrived and armed in this prince's right, here for our country's cause swear we to him all homage, fealty, and forwardness." These lines seem a statement calculated for public consumption rather than personal conviction. In like manner, Isabella, king's wife, her references to the deity are blatantly self-serving. Her words can scarcely be accepted at face value because her actions belie them. Were Marlowe concerned with reducing the play's complexity to a simplistic story of crime and punishment, we might hear Mortimer acknowledge providential design, or at least his own culpability. But he does no such thing. Instead, he says this, when his power is broken. Base fortune, now I see that in thy wheel there is a point to which, when men aspire, they tumble headlong down. That point I touched, and seeing there was no place to mount up higher, why should I grieve at my declining fall? Nowhere in the play does any character suggest that fortune is an executrix of providence. Nowhere in the play is fortune said to perform or retribute a function. Nowhere in the play is there even a convincing assertion of providentialism. For his part, the king refrains from seeing his end as a simple story of cause and effect. Taking refuge at an abbey, when his power is broken, he reflects on the sheer fact of desolation. He says, stately and proud, in riches and in train, whilom I was, powerful and full of pomp. But what is he whom rule and empery have not in life or death made miserable? Here we find a contrast between prosperity and adversity, a rueful recognition that power is evanescent, that misery is the inevitable lot of the living. We look in vain for a sign that Edward recognizes a connection between his misrule and his end. Confronted by the Earl of Leicester, the king evinces no sense of guilt and assigns no responsibility. He says, O day, last of all my bliss on earth, center of all misfortune, all my stars. His rhetorical question never finds a response within the play. Nowhere does he propose a principle of causation beyond mutability. As the scene at the Abbey demonstrates, Marlowe is more interested in delineating the spectacle of defeat and in wringing from it every possible theatrical effect than in having the characters themselves trace a connection between failure and the ensuing misery. In this focus, Marlowe departs from the 16th century moral movements, which at their close typically draw reassuring lessons about virtue and vice. In fact, the Abbey scene has a distinctly classical flavor. King Edward's reflections could almost have been written by Seneca more than 1,500 years earlier. Leicester, as he apprehends the king, actually quotes 2 lines of the Roman playwright, which Jasper Haywood translates as, whom dawn of day hath seen in pride to reign, him overthrown hath seen the evening late. Now, although Cambyses and Edward II are very different achievements, they share a willingness to embrace conflicting visions of life. Preston allows both to coexist somewhat uneasily at his conclusion. In King Cambyses' final speech, we hear of both contingency and retributive justice. And although the audience of Marlowe's play may see a rough justice at work, the principal characters themselves do not. They trace their demise to chance and change. Personified in Fortune, who ensures that suffering catches up, the virtuous and the villainous alike. The destructive force of characters experienced in Edward II may or may not culminate in anything resembling righteousness. Preston's play and Marlowe's together point to a double outlook that takes us to the very heart of Elizabethan tragedy. Indeed, virtually every tragedy of Marlowe and Shakespeare's age represents a negotiation between irreconcilable views of the world. Hamlet is the instance par excellence of this twofold vision. By the final act, the protagonist has come to believe that there's a divinity that shapes our ends, that heaven was ordinate in allowing him to substitute one letter for another on the voyage, thus saving him from execution. There is special providence in the fall of a sparrow. Although he has all along been obsessed by fortune, her slings and arrows, her pipe, her wheel, Hamlet's embrace of St. Matthew's dictum about providence allows him finally to believe that he's become an instrument of divine will, rather than a victim of circumstance. With this conviction, he embarks upon the contest with Laertes, slaying both him and Claudius. Shakespeareans have a tendency to align Hamlet's remarks about providence with the sense that the deaths of Claudius and Laertes represent a satisfying end to their treachery, and that their demise is consonant with divine purpose. Horatio, however, nowhere endorses either the prince's equanimity or the audience's satisfaction over the death of malefactors. His remarks about accidental judgments, casual slaughters, and mischance are in fact incompatible with the notion of an all-encompassing divine design that ensures a just outcome. Although one critic maintains that Horatio's accidental judgments, casual slaughters can be accommodated in the same worldview as Hamlet's, the special providence that follows Sparrow, chance, in fact, has no place in the Christian world, at least in the view of John Calvin and his followers. As Calvin asks, will one say that nothing happened by fortune or chance? I answer that Basilius Magnus have truly said that fortune and chance are heathen men's words, with the signification whereof the minds of the godly ought not to be occupied. John Véron, a French preacher appointed prebendary of St. Paul's Cathedral in 1559, writes that the scripture might the better express that nothing at all is done in the world without his appointment and ordinance. It doth inscribe and attribute unto him, God, those things that seem to be most casual, that seem, I say, to be a very chance and fortune. Pierre de la Primaudet calls fortune a counterfeit goddess. She's nothing else but a feigned device of man's spirit and an imagination without truth. Now, Horatio, of course, listens attentively to the prince's interpretation of the strange voyage as signifying heavenly intervention. But he's reduced to monosyllabic replies during the graveyard scene. He appears to stand at the grave edge in silence. Because he's not himself experienced the events that Hamlet describes, and has not felt what Hamlet has felt, Horatio does not share Hamlet's confidence about being guided rather than manipulated. Horatio's silence implies something else, I suggest. Horatio's outlook has the virtue of corresponding to what he's witnessed, namely an accumulation of inexplicable and contingent events. Although his summary to the ambassador is today often deemed unsatisfactory, he's not mistaken in his stress on the part taken by chance. The chance arrival of the players at Elsinore is utilized by Hamlet to expose the king. By chance, Hamlet comes upon him praying. By chance, Polonius, not Claudius, is killed. Chance again brings the pirate ship, and chance puts into Hamlet's hand the rapier, which is given him a mortal wound, as chance has been responsible for the death of Gertrude. Hamlet may choose to interpret such incidents as part of some overarching design, but Horatio does not. Instead, his speech to the ambassador constitutes what has been called a statement of awful chaos. He represents what might be called a counter-conviction in the world of the play, one that's far older than Christianity. We know from Hamlet's own testimony that Horatio is a stoic, indifferent to fortune's buffets and rewards. Hence the prince's compliment, thou hast been as one in suffering all that suffers nothing. Whatever pain Horatio may have endured in the past, he's learned to confront the world with a dispassionate eye. This is precisely why the volatile prince is drawn to him in the first place, and admires him above all others. By temperament and experience, Horatio registers a no-nonsense skepticism. Thus, when the ghost first appears to Hamlet and beckons him to follow, Horatio seeks to dissuade the prince lest some harm ensue. The prudent Horatio has a pragmatic recognition of deceptive appearance in a fickle world. And so at the denouement, he distrusts Claudius, anticipates with foreboding Hamlet's fencing match with Laertes, volunteers to extricate the prince from the swordplay that will issue his death. Horatio says, "I will say you are not fit." He confronts hard truths without subordinating them to a benign overriding scheme. No wonder he conjoins judgments and accidents, frustrating any complacent assumptions we may be tempted to reach about justice. Indeed, the word justice has no place in his lines to the ambassador. Though steeped in Christianity, the play acknowledges the claims of Stoicism and the ancient culture that produced it. In fact, even at the very moment Hamlet affirms belief in providence, he evokes en passant the classical world. When he rebuffs Horatio's cautionary counsel about the swordplay at court, saying, "We defy augury," Hamlet metaphorically alludes to the Roman practice of divining the will of the gods by studying the flight of birds. His affirmation of providence in the fall of a sparrow, borrowed from the Gospel of St. Matthew, immediately follows the word augury. Shakespeareans customarily see in the word providence a repudiation of what Bowers calls superstition. Contrasting the ending of Hamlet with the endings of Greek tragedies, Bowers writes, "The Elizabethan audience can only approve Hamlet's rejection of pagan superstition in favor of a Christian reliance on providence." In the same fashion, Stephen Doloff more recently speaks of the prince's rejection of augury for Christian providence. And as Bowers does, he contrasts providence with superstition. But do the words defy augury point to a rejection of superstition? Or is Hamlet simply declaring that he will no longer anticipate and calculate the future as he has in the past? What Bowers and Doloff construe as antithesis may just as readily be interpreted as juxtaposition, in view of the prestige of Roman civilization in Shakespeare's England. In the opening scene of Hamlet, Horatio speaks of the most high and pommy state of Rome. When the players visit Elsinore, Hamlet recalls a play he once saw and particularly admired. Quote, "One speech in it I chiefly loved, 'twas Aeneas's talk to Dido." And he prevails on the player to recite the speech, which describes the destruction of Troy, leading to the flight of Aeneas and the subsequent founding of Rome. Just before the play within the play, Polonius recalls having acted at university the role of Julius Caesar. In addition, Shakespeare fills the play with a panoply of classical references to Hercules, Niobe, Lethe, Pyrrhus, Priam, Hecuba, Phoebus, Hecate, Mercury, Hyperion, and Alexander the Great. To these, we may add Hamlet's repeated invocations of Fortune personified, a fixture of ancient Roman culture, who stubbornly refused to be banished from a Christian world, and who managed to flourish anew in the 16th century, despite the best efforts of the Protestant reformers. For the Elizabethans, Rome had reached the summit of aesthetic achievement. Shakespeare's contemporaries thus emulated ancient architecture and sculpture. They prized ancient history, literature, and philosophy. In Seneca and tragedy, invoked by Polonius, they found an inspiration for their own. It may be more than coincidence that the Spanish tragedy, progenitor of Hamlet, and the most influential play of Elizabethan England, juxtaposes two different worlds, though Kyd manages this through a double plot. The Spanish court, at least initially, focuses on a dispute needing to be adjudicated, and later on a quest for justice that begins with the Knight Marshal Geronimo seeking the identity of his son's killers, carefully gathering evidence, and looking to the king and the heavens for redress. Meanwhile, the Portuguese court seems from the start to be ruled by irrationality. That of the viceroy who precipitates war with Spain, and that of Fortune who presides over the ensuing chaos. If at the play's opening the King of Spain thanks the heavens for news of Spanish success, and prudently rewards both Horatio and Lorenzo for capturing the enemy prince, the two Portuguese scenes reveal a self-absorbed ruler who, imagining himself a victim, complains against the power he deems responsible. He says, "Fortune is blind, and sees not my deserts. So is she deaf, and hears not my laments." Like the fortune he bemoans, he embodies volatility, leaping to hasty and ill-considered conclusions, trusting Filippo when he falsely claims that Alexandro has killed the Portuguese prince. The execution of an innocent man is averted only by the unexpected entrance of the ambassador back from Spain with news that the viceroy's son is in fact alive and well. So sudden is this arrival that it seems capricious, the work of fortune, whom the viceroy blames for his conduct. He says, "First we are placed upon the extremest height, and oft supplanted with exceeding heat, but ever subject to the wheel of chance." If the ambassador had been delayed by only a few minutes, Alexandro would have burned to death at the stake. We are left to ponder how narrowly the catastrophe is averted, unfortunately. How an innocent man is nearly executed under the aegis of a pitiless fortune. As the two plots begin to converge in anticipation of a dynastic wedding, the protagonist, who is all along merely personified the thrust of justice, veers toward vengeance, and thrice quotes Seneca, the ancient Regina. His plays dramatize a baffling and brutal world that can be successfully confronted only with stoicism. Significantly, the Elizabethan translators of Seneca's tragedies see in those plays the same two forces that Kyd dramatizes in the Spanish tragedy. Alexander Neville, in the epistle to his translation, Oedipus, describes his purpose as similar to Seneca's, quote, "which was by the tragical and pompous show on stage to admonish all men of their fickle estates, to declare the unconstant head of wavering fortune, for sudden interchange and soon altered face, and lively to express the just revenge and fearful punishments of horrible crimes, wherewith the wretched world in these our miserable days hideously swarmeth." In Horatio's words to the ambassador, we find an understanding of life that seems much closer to Seneca's than to that of the 16th century influence. And Horatio's view finds a counterpart in a plethora of other tragedies, ancient and Elizabethan. Hearing these words to the ambassador, we find ourselves in much the same dramatic terrain as Marlowe's Edward II and Shakespeare's Richard II when they confront catastrophe. Or Thomas Lodge's Marius, who in the wounds of civil war contemplates crushing setbacks. Or Sabrin in the lamentable tragedy of Locrine, who witnesses a parent's suicide and asks, "Rueful spectacle of fortune offered to my Hamlet." Or Kyd's Geronimo, who in the Spanish tragedy learns just how painful and pointless this life is. Shakespeare's Horatio takes his place among these figures and scores of others on the Elizabethan stage, who seem largely unconcerned with exploring the relationship between blunder and calamity. And few of them express a conviction of providential solicitude. Indifferent to the nostrums that mollify modern readers and audiences, these characters have little use for the redemption narrative built into our culture's DNA. Collectively, the characters remind us that the world is ultimately inscrutable, that jeopardy is inescapable, that our experience defies rational explanation, that an unstable field of circumstance surrounds us, that flux and accident and malice are always at hand, waiting to take a fearful toll, that as the player king in Hamlet observes, joy grieves on slender